What my role today is to talk a bit about setting the stage for a flood risk and resource management strategy. And the question we want you to think about is, what do we want to accomplish? And I'm not talking about what do we want to accomplish here at this forum, but what do we want to accomplish as a nation as it relates to this issue of flood risk management and resource management. So I'm going to go through a series of questions, observations, and some things, perhaps get some thoughts going. And the first question I have for you is, has a century of work in flood protection resulted in an outcome that we would wish to continue into the future in its current form? So think about where we've been and think about, would we continue down that path for the future? And I think some observations, some things we need to be thinking about is that as a nation, water resource development has been our de facto floodplain and coastal policy for nearly a century. And will this policy approach be satisfactory for the future? Think about the day and time when that policy was first being crafted in terms of water resources development. It was a time when we were trying to expand the populations across the country. It was a time when we were trying to make the desert bloom, if you will, if you go back into the old days of the Water Resources Acts and the Bureau of Reclamation. As a resident of Phoenix, I can certainly tell you that I think we've probably succeeded in terms of expanding the boundaries into where we weren't 40 or 50 years ago, or perhaps 80 years ago. And so the question we're looking at today as we move to the future, what should our vision be for our nation's water resource policy? It's critical that we begin to think about that as we move forward with this notion of flood risk. Question 2, should we be concerned about the extent and condition of our floodplain and coastal resources? Well, we heard from Jeannie early on that there are things happening within the wetlands, but beyond that is the ability of floodplain resources to provide fisheries, clean water, habitat, and other functions for our future is in question. And we need to ask ourselves, what adjustments are necessary to ensure our resources are sufficient for the future? If you really roll back into traditional economic theory and traditional economic discussion, our economy is not necessarily based upon our investments in Wall Street. Our economy is based upon the natural resource base that underpins our entire economy. Well, we've just come through perhaps 100 years where we have had an abundance of water. We have had an abundance of other natural resources, and we have not had to place the value on those underpinning resources to the extent that perhaps we will have to in the future. And what I'm going to suggest is that if we don't begin to understand what's happening with our natural resources, we very likely could undo the economic gains that we have pointed to in the last 100 years with our water resource investments. Jackie and myself co-wrote an article for Symposium 1 called The Need for a Resource Conservation Ethic in Flood Risk Management. Jackie did include that in the background reading so you have a copy. And likewise, it was published in News and Views, and we're getting a fair number of positive comments on that. But it's this notion that as we move forward into the future, we do need to make sure we're restoring this balance between the resource management issues as well as the flood risk management issues themselves. Question 3 to consider. How do we craft a flood risk and resource management policy and strategy that will make a difference in human behavior? Well, Dennis gave us some insights on that. But I guess the question is, as individuals and policymakers simply do not understand or choose to ignore flood risks or threats to our resources. Question number 4, how do we adapt to a changing world, climate, population, and economies? This issue itself is going to be really dominating a lot of what we need to be talking about, not only tomorrow, but in the future. We traditionally are much better at planning based upon past histories versus forecasting with many unknowns. Think about how we have identified our flood hazards to date. Our entire history for the past 50 to 75 years has based upon what happened in the past will tell us what's going to happen in the future. With climate change before us, is that still a valid assumption? Likewise, as we start thinking about populations in this country, Scott alluded to the fact earlier, we're at 310 million people today. If we're a 400 million person nation, will we be seeing the same type of response mechanisms, the same type of impacts, the increased populations in cities? What's going to be changing? We're looking at a very different future. But right now, as we begin to talk about this flood risk management and resource strategy, it has many broad implications, and this is really the heart of the work that we need to be doing at this forum. We need to consider the fact that risk management introduces this notion of a risk continuum versus being at risk or not at risk. Now, The at-risk or not at-risk phenomena is something that probably has impacted more of our behavioral considerations, but likewise it has had very profound impacts on how we approach mitigation. We have approached mitigation primarily as an all or nothing types phenomena for too many years, and the notion with a risk continuum is that we could actually begin to lower risk incrementally. So it provides some very interesting potential. If we move forward with a properly grounded flood risk management strategy, it should allow the ability to benchmark and monitor risk at various levels. Again, I was very taken by what Jeannie was mentioning on the wetlands. That notion that they had an inventory, they started with a benchmark and they were beginning to identify where they wanted to go down the track, I think is very instructional to where we need to be thinking about where we need to be going with flood risk. Flood risk opens the door for considering and communicating a series of actions that increase or decrease risk. And to be effective must be inclusive of a variety of uses and functions within floodplains and coastal areas. Again, this notion that we cannot put forth a flood risk management policy that is purely looking at property damage, but must be all-encompassing. So what I'm going to be doing next is putting forth a series of 5 challenges that I want you all to be thinking about. And when Jerry comes up here and starts to facilitate, have these in the back of your mind, but be thinking about this as we meet the forum itself. So first off, what is the overarching vision for our nation's flood risk management policy? Now, I'm not here to suggest that in a day and a half we can come up with what those metrics are or what we're going to precisely accomplish, but for definitional purposes, let's go ahead and assume that we have flood risk is controlled, whatever controlled means. We have individuals and policymakers acting in an appropriate manner, and we have floodplain resources are sufficient in aerial extent and quality to meet our needs. So as a loose goal, let's think about that as being our challenge. So what is the overarching vision? And recognize that if we are going to be successful with a flood risk management strategy, we actually need to spend the time in the upcoming years to flesh these out so we know where we're trying to head. Challenge 2, how do we benchmark and monitor our progress towards achieving this overarching vision? Where do we get the resources to be able to provide the data? And what are the metrics we're going to be using to try and measure and monitor that progress? As we move forward and begin to look at this challenge too in terms of benchmarking and monitoring our progress, you're going to be participating in an exercise tomorrow where you're actually going to be developing a risk dashboard that you and your group are going to be putting together. Our notion is can we begin to identify those key variables that will make a difference in terms of managing the nation's flood risk. Challenge 3, how do we get the public to act in a more risk-aware and resource-sensitive manner? Now, I think Dennis provided a lot of insight in terms of how we might go about doing this, but the next question is how would we implement this? What were some of the key messages we need to be discussing, some of the key recommendations to bring forth in terms of how we would actually execute on moving forward with the research that Dennis presented? Challenge 4, what do we need to adjust in policy and programs to meet the overarching vision and overcome our other challenges? We'll be having sessions at this forum specifically thinking about this. As we begin to pull together our dashboards, as we begin to pull together these various concerns, what can we point to in terms of things that we need to be working on, things we need to be fixing? What becomes the legacy of this event? And finally, what are the knowledge gaps that we need to fill?